Teresa Skubik, and this is Forum Daily for Friday, February 13th. Prime Minister Mark Carney is in Tumbler Ridge, BC, to attend a vigil for the lives lost in the deadly shooting. The Prime Minister's office says Carney was invited by the town's mayor and that he invited all other federal party leaders to join him.
Been grieving since the horrific events of Tuesday, and nowhere is that grief more deeply felt than in the community of Tumbler Ridge itself. The residents have come together to support each other in this time of indescribable pain, and obviously, Mr. Speaker, we want to assure them they are not alone. The Minister of Public Safety is in Tumbler Ridge working with colleagues, including the Member of Parliament, working with provincial and municipal partners to hear directly from the community and coordinating with those levels of government. Service Canada officials are planning to be present very soon on the ground as well, and we expect that further updates will be provided from the RCMP as information becomes available and as their investigation progresses. Finally, Mr. Speaker, at the invitation of the Mayor of Tumbler Ridge, the Prime Minister will be travelling to the community on Friday to attend a vigil in memory of the victims of this week's tragic shootings, and the Prime Minister has invited leaders of all parties to accompany him to the community. Mr. Speaker, this has been a dark week in the history of our country, and I know we will all, working together, get through this, and we continue to send our heartfelt best wishes and sympathies to the people of Tumbler Ridge.
The offices of Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet, NDP interim leader Don Davies, and Green Party leader Elizabeth May all confirmed that they would attend. Carney and the other party leaders delivered statements in the House of Commons on Wednesday, pledging unity and their full support for the town and the families of the victims. Days after the horrific mass shooting at Tumbler Ridge Secondary School, BC Premier David Eby says the community is beginning to share stories of extraordinary courage. Eby, who visited Tumbler Ridge on Wednesday, said he heard first-hand accounts of bravery, including students protecting one another in the chaos and first responders carrying out their duties under gunfire to care for injured children. He said even in the darkest moments, there were powerful examples of people stepping up to help.
You know, I was incredibly honored with the trust that people placed in me when I was up there, what they shared with me. The stories are theirs to share. What I will say is, there were stories of students protecting other students. There were stories of teachers pulling the injured out of the hall to perform CPR. There were stories of first responders going in under gunfire to look after kids. And stories of volunteers with the fire department. Volunteers with the volunteer fire department showing up to see and to pitch in on what can only be described as a horrific scene. I hope that the people of Tumbler Ridge are able to share their stories directly, because they are deeply moving and they are deeply inspiring about the nature of humanity, which is universal, and how we support each other in a moment of crisis. But they're not my stories to share.
And later in the day, Premier David Eby and Federal Public Safety Minister Gary Anandasangri spoke at a vigil. More than 24 people were injured in the shooting, and Premier Eby said one of them, a 12-year-old girl named Maya Gibala, is clinging to life in the hospital.
I've only been in town for maybe about an hour and a half or 2 hours now. I've seen 1/1000th of what the community is dealing with here. And I can tell you that this is an incredibly strong community. Every single person I've spoken to, from Dustin, the fire chief, to the lead RCMP investigators, to people in the community, everybody's worried about somebody else. Every single person has said, well, just make sure you're looking after this group of people. No one is focusing on themselves here. Everybody is reaching out to support someone else in this community right now. And it's also a community that's clearly in shock. The full extent of what has happened is not sunk in. And there are going to be some long days, weeks, and months ahead. The stories are just starting to come out about everyone who stepped up to protect, to save lives, It's horrifying and inspirational at the same time, and there just aren't words to describe the feelings in this town right now.
As we mourn the death, senseless death of so many young people, what we can do here as a federal government is to support the local community.
The grief extended across the province yesterday as British Columbia marked an official day of mourning to honor the victims of the Tumbler Ridge mass shooting. The province canceled the scheduled speech from the throne, and instead the Legislative Assembly observed a moment of silence. In Tumbler Ridge, mourners gathered once again, holding candles and remembering the lives lost in the attack. A powerful show of unity as the community begins the long road to healing. The parents of Kylie Smith, one of the young girls tragically gunned down during the mass shooting, spoke about their daughter. Smith's father said that his daughter, Kylie, was a gentle soul.
She was just a beautiful soul. She's a light in our family. She loved art and anime. She wanted to go to school in Toronto. And we just loved her so much. She was thriving in high school. She never hurt a soul. She was a supporter, LGBTQ supporter, and she was the last person who ever deserved this. I let her go to school with her brother Ethan in the morning, and I soaked in that moment watching them walk in the door together for whatever reason, and I didn't know it would be the last time they'd go to school together. Let's stop giving this psychopath the recognition, because these kids were lost before they got to become teenagers. So let's put their pictures up, please, and remember them, not this murderer.
And in an interview on Primetime Politics, Liberal MP Tlaib Noor Mohammed spoke about the profound impact the Tumbler Ridge school shooting has had across British Columbia and on members of parliament from all parties. He says the tragedy has shaken communities throughout the province and deeply affected lawmakers in Ottawa. Many of them are parents themselves. Noor Mohammed noted that beyond the political sphere, there is a shared sense of grief and solidarity.
Canadians are galvanized by this moment. They're trying to figure out how they can help. But every one of us, right now, the best that we can do is to be there with our love, our support, and our thoughts for the families, the victims, the kids, the first responders, the entire community of Tumbler Ridge. It's unimaginable. And, in a province that has prided itself on being a safe place where we take care of each other, this cuts very, very deep, and people are shaken. And it has really brought people together. If there's a silver lining, it is that people are uniformly just asking what they can do to help and how they can hold the community close. This is not a time for partisanship, right? This is a time for us to all just lean in together and to put some of that aside. And you saw that in the most beautiful of ways yesterday in the House with the Prime Minister's speech, with the Leader of the Opposition speech. And I think for me, one of the most powerful moments was when the Bloc leader chose to speak in English, but I think it's for the first time he may have done that, so that the people in Tumbler Ridge could hear directly from him that in that moment we were all united. And in this we are all united, and that we're there with them. And I think that's a strong message to send to Canadians. It's a strong message for Canadians to see that unlike other places where things like this become flashpoints to tear people apart, that we are bound and determined to stick together and to work together and to put everything aside in support and in service of the folks that are really, really hurting. One of the things that was particularly gratifying to see is the way in which Canadian media covered this, how they gave distance, respect, space to the first responders, to the families, to the community. And you didn't have a bunch of political experts weighing in on theory, but really focusing on the hurt and the anguish in that community. And to their credit, the RCMP presented the facts that they had them, made it clear that there would be no speculation until they knew exactly what was going on. And I mean, I think it really it dignified this tragedy with what it deserves: the respect, the consideration, the thoughtfulness, and the decency that every one of these victims and their families deserve at this moment.
At a news conference in Ottawa, Bloc Québécois leader Guy-François Blanchet discussed his recent private meeting with Prime Minister Mark Carney, saying the two covered 6 key issues of importance to both Quebec and the country as a whole. Blanchet highlighted discussions ranging from domestic concerns to broader legislative matters, including a possible amendment to the criminal code regarding religious exemptions and road safety issues.
I didn't go there in order to reach or extract agreements, but in order to make suggestions and proposals to the Prime Minister. And I must repeat, each time we meet, things go well. We get along pretty easily, and the longer between our meetings, the worse it becomes. So we even agreed that we should do that more often. We looked into several issues. They took a lot of notes of what was discussed, and I expect that we will go. A few things are going well. We believe that C9 will hopefully go forward with the amendment that we proposed.
And Pierre Poilievre has solidified his hold on Canada's Conservative Party leadership, earning a strong endorsement from party members despite recent election losses. In a leadership review held last week in Calgary, delegates gave Poilievre 87.4% of the vote. Delegates and party insiders say the priority is clear: regrouping, refining their message on key issues like the economy, affordability, and national unity. Earlier, I sat down with Anthony Kosh, managing principal at AK Strategies, who broke down what this says about Poilievre's standing among Conservatives.
Yeah, so here's the thing. The last time that we've actually had a leadership review following an election loss was actually Stephen Harper in the immediate aftermath of the 2004 election loss. Both Andrew Scheer and Aaron O'Toole didn't make it to a leadership review before they were removed either through resignation or by caucus. But Stephen Harper received a much higher percentage of the score than Harper did post-2004. I believe he was in the low 80s. And then I guess the previous time you have to really go back before that was actually Joe Clark in the 1980s. And I think he received somewhere in the high 60s, low 70s. So it's a very high mark. And I think what it speaks to is that in spite of the fact that the last election didn't go quite as I think any conservative across the country was hoping for, that Mr. Poilievre still very much enjoys the confidence of conservative voters and especially conservative members across this country.
There's been a lot of talk about refining the message. Anthony discussed what that means exactly and what needs to change.
You know, that's the best part, right? In any political environment, there's never going to be any shortage of pundits or strategists or advisors, would-be advisors, I should say, who want to tell people that they need to pivot on this. And if they would just do this a little bit differently, everything would work well. I think we find ourselves in a difficult position. Donald Trump's doing us no favors. Again, you know, just a few days ago, losing it over a new bridge being built, even though that it was paid for by the Canadians and it had been long announced and it wasn't anything new. Now we see today an announcement that the president's considering just pulling out of the USMCA or CUSMA altogether. So it's hard to navigate these times. These are difficult, especially when you're not in government and you're not able to immediately actually respond to things as they develop. But on the whole, I think the fact that the party is staying razor focused on all sorts of issues, but in particular cost of living, things like food inflation, etc., I think that's a recipe for success. But yes, obviously we find ourselves in a very difficult political position. Donald Trump's doing us no favors. But at the end of the day, I think the Conservative Party is doing what they have to do to give themselves the best chance to win the next election at this current moment.
Some have said that despite still having a high level of support nationally, that the Conservatives can't win unless the NDP is revived and splits some of the left-wing vote. Anthony explained how accurate that is and if recalculation is needed to run a campaign that is more of a two-party race nationally.
Yeah, I think the latter. So if there is going to be a reliance on the NDP recovering, I think a lot of Conservatives are going to be very disappointed. By all indications, and there might still be room for a surprise, it does look like Avi Lewis is likely going to be the next leader of the New Democratic Party. There were some questions, for example, if the NDP was going to return a little bit to its more pro-worker roots, if you will, in a candidate like Rob Ashton, who's a longshoreman and the union man. And it looks like they're going to double down on the sort of downtown university salon elite type leadership structure. And I have my doubts about their ability to actually regain a significant portion of their voter base that they might have enjoyed under Jagmeet Singh, or especially under Thomas Mulcair and Jack Layton. So I think I'm prepared to say, at least at this point, that any Conservative strategy to win the next election that is predicated upon the NDP doubling its vote count or becoming competitive in a way that it was in years past should probably be thrown into the fire pit. And we need to just accept that, at least right now, not saying it's going to be forever, but at least for the considerable future, that we need to treat Canadian national politics as if it is a de facto two-party system. And with the I should throw in, with the notable exception of the Bloc Québécois as a regional party, but yes.
Donald Trump and tariffs define the last election. We discussed how important it is for the Conservatives to change their messaging in regards to the U.S. and if Trump should be more of a focus for the Conservative Party.
I definitely think we're talking about him a lot more than we ever have. The complicated part about this is we just don't have a lot of the information that the government does vis-a-vis negotiations. I think one of the things that has been positive is there's been a move towards a more collaborative approach vis-a-vis Canada's approach with the United States and the whole craziness surrounding tariffs, and now the president threatening to pull out of what was basically the foundational free trade agreement of North America. So we'll see. But I do think there's cause for joy, or for optimism, I should say. By all indications, and once again, there may be more surprises down the line, it does appear like the Republicans are going to have a difficult time at midterms coming up in November. And I think a Democratic Congress will be much more favorable to Canada's negotiating position. And I should say more hostile, but less ideological in their approach to trade negotiations with Canada.
There has been a lot of speculation about an election before the U.S. midterm to keep Trump as focus for the next campaign. Anthony explained how likely a snap election is.
Difficult to say if it's likely. I think it's probable. So, I guess it's differences of degrees. I definitely think, though, that if you're a liberal and you're looking at publicly available polling, and if you believe it even slightly, that things definitely look good for you right now. There's a lot of rumors circulating about a spring election. We even had Doug Ford, there were some leaks or some commentary about the fact that the Prime Minister and Premier Ford had actually discussed the prospect of an early election. So it's clearly being discussed. It's clearly on mind, not only for the Canadian public, but also for people in Mark Carney's office, including the Prime Minister himself. I think it's too early to say. But definitely, man, there's no secret about it that when Donald Trump is able to be made the real opponent in a Canadian election for the Liberal Party of Canada, it definitely helps them. And I have no doubt that their strategists and pollsters are probably making similar recommendations to that effect. So I definitely think the Conservatives need to be ready for an election at any time. Coffers seem to be full. Things seem to be ready. I know that there's movement already on nominating candidates much earlier this time than they were in the previous election. So there's definitely steps they can be prepared for that potential eventuality. But I still think it's probably too early to call.
Finally, we discussed how the timing of an election changes the dynamic for the Conservatives.
Well, there's going to be a lot of things, right? That certainly seems like we're moving towards a potential referendum in Alberta on Alberta separation. Now, publicly available polling suggests that it's not going to be a successful effort, but at the same time, this is going to be now part of the national conversation. You're going to have forces on the separatist side that will be mobilized, who will have accesses to resources, lists, and just general assets that never up until this point would have been inaccessible to them. And then by the same token, we've got a pretty serious Quebec election coming up in October. I believe it's October 5th. And at present, the Parti Québécois is in the lead. Now, it doesn't seem to be so strong. Many things can change. What I'm saying, there also needs to be preparation for the potential that you're going to have an independence referendum in Alberta, and you're going to have the election of a separatist government in Quebec, which is already at numerous occasions that their first and only priority, if brought into government, will be a referendum on Quebec independence within 6 months of their election date. So you might end up in a very different situation where not only are we going to be facing this sort of tariff strife and trade negotiations with the United States of America, but you're also going to have two separatist movements, both in Alberta and in Quebec at the same time, causing a sort of domestic political crisis as well. So there's a lot of things that have the potential to derail messaging and also to capture the Canadian public imagination. So there's definitely got to be a lot of preparation to be done about a rapidly changing political landscape, not exclusively focused on the President of the United States, which is obviously occupying a lot of mental space for Canadians for good reason right now, but also be prepared for the fact that we might be facing two separatist movements at the same time, something which is obviously unprecedented in Canadian politics.
Canadians who get the GST benefit will get a one-time top-up payment as early as this spring, worth 50% of the credit. Parliamentarians fast-tracked the Canada Groceries and Essentials benefit to set it in motion. Ottawa says the normal value of the benefit, which is paid to Canadians with low and modest incomes, will also increase by 25% for 5 years starting in July. The federal government says this will help more than 12 million Canadians. Ontario MP Jamil Javani's recent trip to Washington, D.C. has raised eyebrows in Ottawa, sparking questions about the purpose and impact of his visit. The Member of Parliament took the opportunity this week to explain his trip in an article for the National Post, outlining the conversations he had and the connections he made while in the U.S. Our contributor, David Clement, has more.
Conservative MP Jamil Javani has penned a detailed account in the National Post about his recent trip to Washington and his growing concerns about Canada's approach to trade negotiations with the United States. The piece offers a glimpse into the anxieties of Canadian auto workers and raises questions about whether Ottawa is repeating past mistakes. Javani begins his commentary with a visit to the GM plant in Oshawa, a facility he describes as feeling mythical to longtime residents who remember when it was a prosperity hub for tens of thousands of families. Now, while the plant remains important, far fewer Canadians work there today, though through the union's fighting spirit, they persist despite layoffs and shift cuts. During his visit last month, Javani met with a union leader who expressed deep disappointment over news that Canada would soon be importing Chinese EVs. The leader viewed this as a sign that the federal government is abandoning Canadian auto workers, a sentiment Javani says is shared by many Canadians as private sector employment continues to decline. The country shed 52,000 private sector jobs in the last month alone, leading some economists to describe the situation as a recession watch. Against this backdrop, Javani traveled to Washington for what he calls a whirlwind trip filled with productive conversations. He met with President Donald Trump, Vice President J.D. Vance, and Secretary of State Marco Rubio, along with senators from Montana, Ohio, and Wisconsin, and the U.S. Trade Representative. Businesses employing thousands of Canadians also shared their perspectives on Canada-U.S. trade. The MP says he found doors open for dialogue at a time when pessimism dominates the media coverage. He credits his 15-year friendship with Vice President Vance for helping open those doors, but says he encountered widespread optimism about moving trade negotiations forward. Javani discussed the importance of CUSMA, the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, to communities like his own riding of Bowmanville, Oshawa North. However, Javani is careful to note there's only so much he can share publicly before debriefing Prime Minister Mark Carney and Minister Dominic LeBlanc, out of respect for their responsibilities in negotiating with the U.S. He says it's important to coordinate before revealing too much. But the MP does highlight one critical observation. Mexico appears to be further ahead in its engagement with the U.S. than Canada is. On January 28th, Mexico and the U.S. announced formal talks on CUSMA reforms. A week later, they announced a joint action plan for critical minerals. Neither announcement included Canada. Javani warns that this pattern is reminiscent of the 2017 CUSMA negotiations under then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, when Mexico advanced its negotiations with the U.S. while Canada was largely sidelined. Only at the last minute, when a bilateral Mexico-US agreement became a real possibility, was Canada brought back into the process to maintain the trilateral arrangement. The MP argues it would be a mistake to repeat 2017, particularly because Canadian workers and businesses deserve full representation in a process with such significant economic impact. The GM workers in Oshawa, he says, deserve to know what their government does and if they're doing everything possible to protect their jobs and encourage investment. Giovanni suggests the federal government's current approach is hurting Canada's ability to assert itself in important discussions about North America's future. While acknowledging the partisan appeal of making trade a political wedge issue, especially with rumors of a snap election, he argues that exceptional issues require exceptional action. Citing former Prime Minister Stephen Harper's call for national unity on trade issues with the U.S., Giovanni advocates for what he calls a multi-partisan approach to Canada-U.S. trade. He believes this would enable truly strategic diplomacy that recognizes the importance of relationships, noting that trade agreements are more than just an exchange of term sheets. The MP's message here is clear. Canada needs strategic diplomacy now more than ever, and partisan politics should take a backseat to protecting Canadian workers and our national interests.
Canada is poised to fall short on its earlier commitments to combat climate change. The Canadian Climate Institute has published a new report suggesting the country has lost its way in meeting targets, including the 2026 interim emissions reduction target. The paper also noted that the long-term goal of reaching net zero emissions by 2050 may now be out of reach, and there is plenty of blame to go around. Provincially, Alberta and Saskatchewan both weakened and suspended their industrial carbon prices, and Ontario repealed its climate accountability legislation. Many in Alberta feel that the suspension of the federal clean electricity regulations is a big win for the province. You can include Alberta's Affordability and Utilities Minister Nathan Neudorf in that conversation. Neudorf also explained how nuclear energy is set to become a big part of Alberta's future. He shared these details with our Western Canada Bureau Chief, Hal Roberts.
Nathan, why was Ottawa's suspension of the clean electricity regulations really good news for us here in Alberta?
Well, Hal, it was tremendous news because if they had stayed in place, quite literally, it could have driven Alberta's power bills up by over 35% and made our grid 100 times less reliable. And that's according to the Alberta Electric Systems Operators analysis of the regulations. So this is just huge that we've got these suspended. We're continuing to do more work on that. And it's already beginning to unlock what is expected to be somewhere upwards of $6 billion and maybe even up to $18 billion of private investment in new natural gas generation, which is just tremendous for our province, for our private industry to create jobs and create energy and provide the power we need for everything from homes and hospitals and schools to industry and commercial development. So very, very good news for Alberta indeed.
Now, the recent MOU signed between Alberta and Ottawa says that our province agrees to a net zero power grid by the year 2050. Would that force the province to maybe phase out natural gas power generation, since facilities would have to be built for carbon capture and storage? Plus, you'd have to purchase carbon credits to offset emissions, would you not?
Well, that is a possibility, but actually, in fact, the MOU unlocks the potential of further investment because it allows us the freedom to have our assets run for their entire lifespan and allows our assets to be continually updated with the best technology. So we achieve a win-win scenario. And like I mentioned earlier, what we're seeing in response from private industry is a renewed interest and of investment instead of the opposite. So we think the MOU is driving future investment, driving better gains in lowering emissions, and allowing all those assets to have a full lifespan with the best technology and reinvestment. So it's really positive news instead of where we were before, where we were locked down by those clean electricity regs.
When I chatted with Premier Danielle Smith recently about nuclear energy, she says it's still on the table and a feasibility study is underway. How much power could these small nuclear reactors provide? I mean, electricity demand is expected to go up by quite a bit over the next 10 to 20 years.
Absolutely. And literally, it can unlock thousands of megawatts. But it's best to remember that in Alberta, it's driven by private market investment. It's not driven by the government. So, depending on the technology, depending on the site, depending on the application of those private developers and their investment, it could be a smaller modular reactor of 300 megawatts, or it could be a conventional large reactor of 1,000 megawatts per unit. So, we're expecting it to be able to drive consistent baseload, reliable, clean electricity for many, many needs, allowing us to support industry, like I mentioned, or even supporting our neighboring jurisdictions like British Columbia, the Yukon, the Northwest Territories, and potentially even Saskatchewan and Manitoba.
When could they be fully operational? And should we be concerned at all about nuclear energy? I mean, you held an engagement session late last month in Bonnyville. What concerns did locals raise?
Well, they raised what we would expect people to raise. What is it safe? What do you do with the waste? How is it going to impact the environment? How much water is it going to use? And thankfully, in Canada, we've been successfully operating nuclear reactors for over 60 years without any major incidents. We have one of the world's highest regarded regulators in the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission to govern our actions, and we're working closely with them. We are doing this in a responsible way. We are talking to communities. We are talking to our First Nations. We are bringing in experts across Canada in the field to help understand it. And we want to have all of these questions answered with a great path forward before we even start anything like the potential for legislation or regulation. So very proud of our engagement team led by Chantal DeYoung, my parliamentary secretary, talking to Albertans, getting their feedback, and building this the right way right from the start.
Alberta Affordability and Utilities Minister Nathan Neudorf, thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks so much, Hal. Really appreciate you having me.
Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada is closing 7 of its research facilities as part of the federal government's effort to reduce the size of the public service. The closures affect research centers in Guelph and Quebec City, along with 4 satellite research farms across Nova Scotia, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. The department says roughly 665 positions have already been cut, and nearly 1,500 employees received notices. AAFC said the reductions are part of a 3-year plan to achieve savings, while remaining focused on its core mandate. Research centers in Quebec and Guelph did not immediately respond to requests for comment. We sat down with Dr. Sylvain Charlebois with the Agri-Food Analytics Lab to unpack what this move means for Canada's agricultural research capacity.
They do a lot of tremendous work, and this is public research. It's very important to underscore the fact that the research being conducted by these centers is democratic and open, unlike private research, for example. And so every now and then, farmers will call these centers to get some help because of a drought, because of a plant that is not doing well, or perhaps farmers are interested in new cultivars and that have been developed by some of these centers. So certainly a big blow to the sector overall.
We also discussed how significant the closures of centers in Guelph and Quebec City are for ongoing research projects.
Well, it actually varies from one center to another, but I could argue that both Guelph and I would say that Lacombe, Guelph, and Quebec are closures that are going to be impacting farmers in general, because they were pretty big centers. In fact, on Friday when the announcement was made, I was actually right next to right next to the center in Quebec City. So obviously that's certainly something that will affect farmers there. Although they weren't collaborating a whole lot with other centers around them. What's really odd about all this is that it is a government that prides itself as supporting science and making science-based decisions, or they often value science-based policies. Well, that's not exactly in line with that way of thinking.
Dr. Charlebois discussed how these job cuts might affect farmers, food producers, and innovation in the sector.
Well, it's support that they need, and every now and then they can actually just pick up the phone and call someone they trust. And the most important thing is that service actually was provided to them for free, which is important. And not all farmers actually are capable of paying a consultant or paying a scientist and add that person on payroll. So that's certainly something that is important for farmers, especially small scale farmers out there.
The department says the cuts are part of a 3-year plan to save money while staying focused on its mandate. We discussed if that balance is realistic.
I don't know. Like it's the challenge when you close, when you cut scientific capacity, is that if you decide one day to ramp up and actually increase the scientific output of the government, it takes years before you do that, 5 to 7 years, in fact. So when you cut science, then you're cutting science for a long time. So that's why I can only assume that Ottawa really made that decision and consider that decision to be incredibly important. But implications will be felt for several years, to be honest.
Dr. Charlebois shared his perspective on if reducing research staff is an effective way to manage government spending in agriculture, or could it have unintended consequences?
The challenge with Ag Canada in general is that it's not the largest department within government. And so if you cut 700 people, it will impact Ag Canada way more than, say, cutting 800 people in health or at Statistics Canada or other places. That's the thing. And so, and frankly, politically, I suspect that most people don't understand science. They don't necessarily understand agriculture. And so politically, I suspect it was a low-hanging fruit for the current government to cut there specifically.
Air Transat is canceling its last 2 flights into Florida as of this spring, suspending all of its business into the United States. An Air Transat spokesperson said Thursday that flights to Orlando from Montreal will end on May 3rd, along with flights to Fort Lauderdale from Quebec City and Montreal starting in May and June. The decision on whether flights will resume to Florida next fall and winter will be determined at a later date. The spokesperson also noted the airline's presence in the U.S. has been marginal, representing only 1% of Air Transat's available seat kilometer capacity for the summer. Earlier this week, Canadian airline WestJet announced it was cutting service to 10 U.S. cities because of a decline in demand. Flights out of Vancouver, Calgary, Edmonton, and Winnipeg to destinations including Nashville, Los Angeles, Tampa, and San Francisco were being dropped. The Alberta government announced Thursday it is allocating $143 million to create and deploy complexity teams in 476 schools province-wide. Complexity teams, to be made up of 1 teacher and 2 educational assistants, will support the academic and behavioral needs of students in elementary schools, according to a news release from the province. The release said the teams will provide in-class assistance to teachers, such as helping students learn English or managing disruptive students. The province also said the complexity teams will be able to bring additional specialists to classrooms when needed.
And now I'm pleased to announce today that our government is investing $143 million to help our youngest and most vulnerable students in kindergarten to grade 6 in schools with the highest complexity. This will support the creation of up to 476 complexity teams, each one made up of 1 teacher and 2 education assistants that will be deployed to high complexity classrooms across the province to provide teachers with more support and students with more one-on-one attention. And this is only the beginning. The Class Size and Complexity Cabinet Committee will continue to analyze the data, work with our partners, and bring forward recommendations for longer-term actions that will support and strengthen Alberta's school system. Our message to teachers and to school administrators is this: we have heard you, we're here for you, and help is on the way. We want you back doing what you do best, teaching, providing leadership, and shaping the next generation of young Albertans in one of the world's top-ranking school systems.
Now over to news coming out of Milan. The Winter Olympics are often presented as a stage for unity, a place where nations set aside conflict, athletes pursue excellence, and the world comes together in celebration of sport. But on Thursday, that ideal was overshadowed by controversy surrounding the International Olympic Committee, raising difficult questions about neutrality and the limits of political expression at the Games. Ukrainian skeleton racer Vladislav Haraskevich was barred from competing after insisting on wearing what he described as a helmet of memory, created to honor Ukrainian athletes killed during Russia's war against his country. He was informed just 21 minutes before his race that he would not be allowed to compete.
If to be shortly, yes, because I'm defending my rights. I didn't violate any rules. So, yeah, I stand for what I believe is right. It means a lot, and I truly believe that people would not support if it's not right thing. And we had so huge support that I believe that we are on the right side of history. Of course, as an athlete, I always was dreaming about Olympic medal, and it's also like a feeling that it was taken away from me.
IOC President Kirsty Coventry later spoke to reporters, saying that she had tried to persuade the athlete to reconsider, but was unsuccessful.
This is why we have the rules that we do. This is why we have the guidelines that we have, is to ensure that those spaces are very clear, but that they also have spaces where they can freely express themselves and the messages that they want to share with the world. And I believe we've been able to do that. I think that he, in some ways, understood that, but was very committed to his beliefs, which I can respect, right? But sadly, it doesn't change the rules. And the rules were that for certain spaces, the field of play, the ceremonies, the Olympic Village should be spaces where athletes are safe from both sides, and where there is just no messaging of any kind, so that it's fair and so athletes can just focus on competition. I don't think it's ever really been a question around his messaging. It was where the message was happening. And, the emotions coming out, he's an athlete. I wanted to see him compete, right? And sadly, we weren't able to get that to happen.
Canada hasn't won an Olympic medal in skeleton since 2010, but that drought could soon come to an end. All eyes are on Haley Clark as she prepares for her Olympic debut. The 21-year-old from Brighton, Ontario, has already built an impressive resume. In February 2024, she made history in Winterberg, Germany, becoming the youngest athlete ever to win World Championship gold in the sport. Clark carried that momentum into 2025, capturing another gold at the World Junior Championship and further cementing her status as one of Canada's brightest medal hopes heading into the Games. I'm Teresa Skubik. Good night, Canada.